She was just hitchhiking to get back home to see her mother, but unfortunately, she would never make it there alive. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Vickie DeBlieuxc. Viewer discretion is advised. By the way, just in case you hear a dog panting in the background, that's my dog Casey. He is having some anxiety issues today because here in Arizona, in Phoenix, it is downpouring with thunderstorms, and he is not a big fan. I gave him calming chews, but he's still a little nervous, so if you hear it, that's what that is. But Vickie Lynn DeBlieuxc was born on April 18th, 1956. Vickie was born and raised in Louisiana. By the time this case occurs, Vickie is 37 years old and she is a mother. Her daughter would later describe her as being very fun, she was wild, she was crazy, like in a good way. She was so funny. She could make you laugh just so easily. Vickie did the best she could, for her kids, and she was a great mom. But unfortunately, not one, but 4 men would steal Vickie from her family by viciously taking her life. It was February of 1994. Vickie was near the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, and a friend of hers, who I guess lived in the area, dropped her off in Chattanooga, and Vickie's plan was to hitchhike her way to Louisiana to go back home to see her mom. This is in the early 90s. Hitchhiking had at this point started to become kind of a known danger, but it was still something that was still widely used and done by a lot of people still, despite what we now know as the dangers of hitchhiking. But Vickie did it all the time, and she never had any issues, any problems with it. The night of February 21st, 1994, Vickie's friend dropped her off near the I-59 in Chattanooga. Vickie would encounter 4 young men, teenagers. The 4 young men were Carrie Dale Grayson, Kenneth Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Louis Mangione. At that time, they ranged from 17 to 19 years old. Carrie Dale Grayson being the oldest at 19. The 4 boys would encounter Vickie actually in Alabama. This is specifically near the Trussville exit off the I-59 in Alabama. They ask her, "Hey, where are you going?" She says, "I'm going to Louisiana. Do you guys think you could take me?" They say, "Yeah, of course we can." And so Vickie gets into the car, she loads up her luggage, and they drive away, fully expecting Vickie to be headed towards Louisiana. But the 4 teenage boys had a completely different thing in mind. Because instead of driving towards Louisiana, they drove Vickie to a very secluded, wooded location there in Alabama, in the Jefferson County area. The 4 teenage boys and Vickie got out of the car. They all sat down in this wooded area and they began to drink beers. Vickie was like, I'm trying to get to Louisiana, like, what are we doing? How long is this going to take? And then, for no reason, completely unprovoked, the 4 teenagers started to throw their glass beer bottles at Vickie, striking her in the head and in the chest. Vickie suddenly gets up and she starts to run away. The young men decide to chase after her, and they take more of their glass bottles and they chuck it at her. One of them hits Vickie in the back of the head, which causes her to fall to the ground. Once all 4 teenagers surrounded her, they began to kick her profusely, they wouldn't stop. It got to a point where they had kicked her so much that she finally stopped moving, but on closer inspection, they learned that she was actually still breathing. And so what they did was they flipped her over. One of them took their foot with their shoe and they stuck it right on her throat, and they pressed down on her throat, slowly suffocating her. They heard her gurgle blood and saw blood come out of her mouth. And eventually she stopped struggling. She stopped moving. And now Vickie DeBlieuxc stopped breathing. She was dead. The 4 teenagers then took Vickie's lifeless body, put it into the bed of their truck. They drove her and her luggage, everything she had with her, to the Bald Rock Mountain area, where they then took off all of her clothing, they took her jewelry and stole it, and they played with her dead body for a few minutes before just abandoning her there. They actually rolled her off of a cliff, and she fell, many feet below. The 4 young men realized there was blood all over the back of the truck, so they went to a car wash where they got the blood taken out of the truck. They then would go through all of her luggage to see if there was anything valuable, anything they could take, and they took what they could, and then they just disposed of her luggage in the woods as well. They would then take Louis Mangione back home, and then the remaining 3 would go back to Vickie's body, where they then began they played with her more, they mutilated her body, they would cut out her eyes, they chopped off her fingers. I mean, they just so savagely ripped her apart for no reason. And they got done what they needed to get done, I guess, and then they left her again. And then sometime shortly after this, there were a couple of hikers who stumbled across the body of Vickie DeBlieuxc, and they alerted authorities. The coroner would determine that Vickie, this was a horrible death. Her entire skull, there was basically no bone in her skull that was intact. They had fractured every part of her skull. She had bone fractures elsewhere. She had obviously been asphyxiated. They can tell that she had broken bones in her throat. Her left lung had been removed. They also found 180 separate post-mortem stab wounds. And whoever did this had cut 2 very large slits in her chest to open her up and take organs out. But ultimately, her cause of death was blunt force trauma. That is what ended her life. The morning after the teenagers did this, one of the girlfriends of one of these boys would notice that he came home with blood all over him. He just told her, it's blood from a dog, and she just sort of believed it. But Louis Mangione would be the main reason why the 4 individuals were finally apprehended. And that's because he was given some of the fingers of Vickie, and he kept them and was showing them off to people. And then he started basically yapping about what happened. And so police found out about all this because they were turned in, and they arrested all 4 of these teenage boys. 19-year-old Kerry would eventually tell police what happened because he said he wasn't going to be the only one to take the fall for this, just because he was the oldest one. This is what he told police. Kenny, TR, Louis, and myself were all drinking very heavily when TR and Louis suggested that we get into a fight. We left and went riding around and found a hitchhiker at the I-59 exit in Trussville, Alabama. We picked her up and we took her to the Pipeline Medical Center East. We were all talking when she made a remark about killing all of us when I threw a beer bottle at her. Then Kenny hit her with his bottle. Louis hit her with his and TR with his. After that, she began to run when Kenny got her in the back of the head with another bottle, causing her to fall. We all ran over and began to kick her and hit her. When she stopped moving, Kenny saw she was still alive and stood on her throat until she died. Then we took her to Pell City and left the body. We then went to the car wash and washed out the bed of Kenny's truck, and we took Louis home. When we got back to my car, TR and Kenny said we had to show them the way to the body, and I did. When we got there, TR and Kenny began to mutilate her body by cutting off the fingers and cutting open the stomach. TR had found a bottle and shoved it into her vaginal area, and Kenny took out her eyes. After this, we dumped the body and left for TR's house. Kenny and I returned to my car, and we went to Hardee's in Chalkville, and all 3 of us fell asleep in the truck, where Kenny's girlfriend woke us up later that morning. After this, Louis Mangione would also tell police something more concerning. He said that Vickie DeBlieuxc was sacrificed to the devil so that they could drink her blood. But specifically, he said Dale was the one to say that he needed to sacrifice her to Satan because he needed to drink her blood. He said that Dale said it just had to be a relatively young woman, and it needed to be that woman's blood. This is obviously in the mid-90s where the satanic panic thing was running rampant through the entire country. We've had, people who have been convicted of murders. The West Memphis 3 is one you can really bring up, probably the most well-known one, where people were convicted simply because they were perceived to be Satan worshipers or they were sacrificing people to the devil, that whole thing. And so this was right smack in the middle of it. And people were believing it. People really were like, oh, this sacrifice is all out there happening. And this was nothing different. This fed into it even more. But the truth of the matter is that really wasn't the motive. The motive was just they wanted to kill someone. They didn't sexually assault her while she was alive. They didn't rape her. They did sexually mutilate her after she was dead by sticking a bottle in her. But these were just 4 teenage boys who later on they would kind of say that, you know, some of these kids grew up in unstable households. One of them for sure had bipolar disorder that really wasn't being treated properly. These were 4 obviously very troubled young men, and none of them seemed to be getting the help at all that they needed. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that, you know, there's an excuse for doing what they did. It's more of just kind of explaining what their mindset was, how they were as people. I know that Carey, at least him, was deemed legally sane to go to trial. All 4 of them were evaluated by psychologists, and basically what it came down to was that all 4 of them, even if they had some psychological issues like bipolar disorder or whatever kind of else disorder they might have, mental disorder. That just scared the crap out of me, and there was a huge burst of thunder there. Not sure if you heard that. But all 4 of them, while they battled psychological mental health issues, all 4 of them were deemed legally sane to stand trial because all 4 of them knew what they were doing. They knew right versus wrong. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but they chose to do it anyway. They made this decision of sound mind. They decided they were going to take this random woman that just so happened to come across them while she's hitchhiking, and they were going to brutalize her. The 4 teenagers, I believe, were tried individually. And what it would come down to is that all 4 of them were eventually found guilty of their parts in the crime. Trace Duncan was the first one of them to go on trial. He was convicted, and in January of 1996, Trace Duncan was sentenced to death. Luis Mangione was the second to go on trial. He was convicted, but he was only sentenced to life in prison without parole. They did not recommend the death penalty for him. Kenneth Loggins was the third one to go on trial. His trial was postponed at least once. Now, he tried to claim that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, but it did not work. The jury did not buy it, and he was convicted of the homicide, and he too was sentenced to death. Carey Dale was the last to go on trial. He was the oldest of the 4. And in late February of 1996, he was convicted of all charges, and he too was sentenced to death. By March 8th, 1996, all 4 men had gone to trial. All 4 men had been sentenced, and the judges in these cases agreed with the penalties each of them were given. And so he signed off on the death penalties. All 4 of the men, especially the 3 who were on death row, had tried to appeal their convictions numerous times, but they always failed their appeals. It even got to the Alabama Supreme Court, where they also denied their appeals. But then the saving grace for a couple of these young men was a United States Supreme Court ruling in 2005 that determined it was now unconstitutional to execute any prisoner if the crime they committed happened while they were under the age of 18, while they were minors. And so Trace Duncan and Kenneth Loggins both would end up having their death penalty sentences overturned, and they were then resentenced to life in prison. And initially, that was going to be without parole. But then another case occurred where they deemed that young people under the age of 18 convicted of a crime, they now have to have some type of parole eligibility. So because 3 of the 4 were under the age of 18, 2 of them sentenced to death, those 2 had it reversed. But now all 3 of these men have the possibility of parole after about 30 to 35 years or so, and they are still in prison. But because Carey Dale Nelson was 19 at the time of the murder, none of this applied to him. He did try to appeal, but it didn't work, and his death sentence was upheld. He would spend about 28 years on death row. So at this time, they were doing lethal injections, but they had also just recently did their first nitrogen gas execution, and it sounds like Carey's attorneys were trying to argue that he should get that one as well. Basically petitioned himself in 2018 to have that style of execution instead of lethal injection. There were issues though, however, because this was such a new thing that there were safety risks with it, that it could be botched, that it could cause some kind of pain for the individuals. But in the end, he won out. Nitrogen gas was going to be his style of execution. It sounds like Vickie's son, by the time, the execution is happening, Vickie's son is obviously, her kids are much older. It sounds like her son was okay with the death penalty for Grayson, but her daughter was actually very much against it. She would say, quote, "Society failed this man as a child, and my family suffered because of it. Murdering inmates under the guise of justice needs to stop. No one should have the right to take a person's possibilities, days, and life." So it sounds like she was possibly more willing for leniency with this man. And obviously you're going to have a lot of conflicting, back and forth with this, because obviously the death penalty is not a subject that most of the country really agrees on. Me personally, I've always been pro death penalty if there is guaranteed, just beyond any reasonable doubt, evidence that this person committed the crime. Hard proof, video proof. We know it was them for sure. Sure, okay. But outside of that, there's so many things wrong with the justice system. We get this stuff wrong all the time. Juries get it wrong. Detectives get it wrong. Prosecutors get it wrong. Defense attorneys get it wrong. There's so much room for error. There's a lot of error. We have executed innocent people before. We have had innocent people on death row who have had their convictions overturned completely, and they were released because DNA evidence, for example, cleared them. So it is not worth executing one innocent person in order to execute the rest. And that's kind of where my stance is if you're truly guilty, we know it, sure, go for it. But other than that, it's such a risk. Carrie Dale would have a final meal of soft tacos, beef burritos, a tostada, chips, and guacamole, and a Mountain Dew Baja Blast. Prior to his execution, Grayson used his final words to spew expletives at the prison officers before his execution, and he also raised both middle fingers while strapped to the gurney. What a guy. Carrie was executed by nitrogen hypoxia, and he was pronounced deceased at 6:27 p.m. on November 21st, 2024. That was actually just a few months ago, really, or almost a year ago. 3 men still rot in a prison cell for what they did to this innocent mother. 1 man has been executed. There is hope that these other 3 men never get released, but it is still a possibility. The horrifics of this case and everything they not only did to her while she was alive, the things they did to her when she was dead was just so cruel. It was so disgusting. It was deplorable. It was evil. This was a full-grown human being who had children, who was a loving, caring mother. She had a mother. She was going to go visit her mom. She was, a family member to many, a friend to many. This was a person. And these 4 young kids treated her like she was nothing more than trash. She did nothing wrong to them. The only thing she's guilty of is she wanted to go visit her mom. That's it. No one deserves what happened to Vickie. But in the end, thankfully, the 4 individuals were caught fairly quickly, and all 4 of them were convicted of their crimes. And Vickie DeBlieuxc got the justice she rightfully deserved. This is a case where the psychic actually got it right. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Nancy and John Bosco. Viewer discretion is advised. It was a blistering August 19th, 1993 day in Big Fork, Montana. Local police were called and asked to do a welfare check on the Bosco residence because a neighbor noticed that their windows had been opened. The neighbor had gone to knock on the doors. They got no response. They saw that basically the vehicles that belonged to the homeowners were still there, so it was very strange that they weren't getting any response to knocking on the door. So police arrive, and when they do so, They notice that there is a lot of fly activity kind of in an upper window of the home. And after they attempt to knock and get someone's attention from inside the home, at that point they have enough probable cause to enter. And so they gain entry to the house. And immediately there is the just absolutely horrid smell of death. He walks up the stairs and finds his way into the master bedroom of this home, where he sees an absolutely brutal scene. There were two bodies lying in the bed. There was blood spatter on the wall. The bodies were clearly very decomposed. The room smelled horrifically. There were thousands of flies in this room, and the bodies were covered in maggots and fly larvae. It was grotesque. They would soon be able to identify the victims as Nancy and John Bosco. They had only been living in Big Fork, Montana for about 6 months. They had just purchased this home. What was immediately strange to police and the coroner on their arrival was that one of the bodies, John, his body appeared to be more decomposed than Nancy's body. John's body his skin was essentially blackened. That's how badly decomposed he was. But Nancy's body wasn't near that level. And so what they just sort of initially came to this conclusion of, just based on their first look, was, did Nancy shoot and kill John, wait some time, and then shoot and kill herself? Well, that theory sounded nice at first, but they knew within moments that that was not the case, because there was no gun at the scene. There was no gun in Nancy's hand, no gun near the bed, on the bed, under the bodies, nowhere to be found. And obviously that's just not possible. They found a black case next to the bed. It looked like a gun case. They opened it. They noticed that the gun that was supposed to be in there was missing. They would later find out that this was a gun that John owned legally, and this was a .357 caliber gun. So they thought, okay, it was the stolen gun that was used to kill John and Nancy. But then the coroner would say, nope, that was not the case, because both victims were shot with a 9mm. They actually found 9mm bullets embedded in one of the walls. So their .357 was stolen, but it was not the murder weapon. No murder weapon was found at the scene. They found that in the basement there was an open low-level window that someone was able to open and enter the home. So they believe that's how the killer entered. They also found that the phone line had been cut and the power had been shut off to the entire house. So this was someone who went into the home with the intent of doing harm to whoever was in there. And they did not want whoever was in the house to be calling anyone. The rest of the house, however, looked in really normal condition. Nothing was out of place, nothing was stolen, there was no signs or indications of a fight or a struggle taking place, no drawers or cabinets open. Everything else in the house was perfect. So this was clearly someone who came into that home with the intent of murdering the couple and then leaving, and that was their whole plan. Okay, so why? What was the motive? I'm not really sure they would ever truly find that out. The coroner would determine that both Nancy and John had been dead about a week or so, and both of their times of death were pretty close to one another. But that was strange to police to hear, because how come Nancy's body looked less decomposed than John's? That was just something super strange. Well, the coroner explained that because the way Nancy's body was found, she was completely covered up with blankets and a pillow over the upper half of her body. And that would slow, because her open wounds weren't visible, that would slow decomposition a little bit, and it would make, for maggots and flies to get to her, it would take longer for that to happen. So that's why she was decomposed less. They also determined that John never woke up. He was shot and killed while asleep in bed. There was a very clean and through gunshot wound to the side of his head. Nancy, however, they believed she woke up from the sound of the gunshot, because next to her side of the bed, they found broken little pieces of glass. Nancy had to wear glasses from time to time, and she never wore her glasses to bed. They believe that once the gunshot went off, that Nancy kind of woke up, got her glasses to put them on just to see what just happened, what that noise was, and then she turned around and saw her attacker, and then because the phone was off the hook, they think she turned back around to grab the phone to call 911, and then the killer shot her in the back. Who were John and Nancy Bosco? John was born on April 17th, 1952, and he was born in Syracuse, New York. He was considered a very good-natured guy. He was well-liked. He was a very chatty and talkative person, but his family would say all that chattiness and his talkative kind of normal behavior would all go away if he was outside exploring, hiking, or just in nature, because he was one who really loved to be one with nature. He loved being outdoors, and he loved just taking in the peace and the quiet of it. He was hardworking. He was someone who did a lot of woodworking, and he made his own stuff, and he was really good with his hands. He could also be known as someone with a hot temper. He had kind of sometimes a rough personality, especially if someone wronged him, but he typically meant well. Eventually, he would father 2 children, and that was when he was living in Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado. Quite some time before this case happened, he had separated from his ex, and there was kind of a back and forth and really kind of tumultuous custody battle that would happen with his 2 kids. He would meet Nancy Renee Peterson in Colorado. Nancy, who was born on March 6, 1951, she was born in South Dakota, but again, at this time living in Colorado. She was a saleswoman, and I guess she would make cold calls to people, and she would go to their homes to, I'm not sure what products she sold, but she would sell products that way. And she just so happened to do a cold call to John Bosco, and he said, yeah, sure, come over, sell me what you got. They met, and they hit it off like immediately, and it was like a match made in heaven. Nancy was a very beautiful young woman. She had dreams of one day becoming a model, and her looks were certainly going to potentially get her there. She was a fun-loving and very outgoing woman. She also had a very silly personality. She also loved being outdoors. She loved to explore and hike and camp, and that's kind of a lot of the things that Nancy and John, they just got along so quickly because they had so much in common. Everyone said that they had this like instant chemistry and that they were just destined to be with one another. And shortly after they became a couple, they would get married. Within about 2 years of their marriage, they actually moved to Big Fork, Montana. They purchased a home from a man named Joe Clark. Joe Clark used to own this home, but I guess because of some fire that happened at one of his businesses or something like that, he had to sell this house, and then he and his family moved somewhere else in Big Fork. And it was the perfect place for John and Nancy. John and Nancy actually planned to operate a woodworking business out of the home. John was going to craft the products, and they were going to have a portion of the house be like a little shop. They'd only lived there for 6 months. How could you have possibly gotten in with some kind of wrong crowd, or how could they have possibly angered someone in that short amount of time that would warrant someone coming in and shooting both of them dead in their home? Well, that's what police struggled with from the get-go. But they did uncover pretty quickly that John had been in a very heated custody battle with his 2 kids and his ex. At one point, his ex was granted full custody, but then it switched to him getting full custody, and then it kind of went back and forth. And then at one point, John takes the kids from Boulder, Colorado, and he moves them to Montana and enrolls them in school, which enrages his ex, who then files court documents and custody documents, and then she goes to Montana. She takes the kids directly out of school, brings them back to Boulder, Colorado. The kids, both of them, absolutely idolized John. I mean, they adored him. They loved him to pieces, and he loved them more than anything. I mean, even more than his wife. Like, he absolutely just, those kids meant everything to him. He was a great dad. He was a really, really wonderful father. And so what they found out, the investigators, is that John and Nancy, because of this custody issue, they had actually planned a trip to drive to Boulder, Colorado to deal with this custody battle. And the plan was they were going to be leaving the day after the murder took place. So they thought to themselves, well, was this a motive? Was maybe someone connected to the ex? Did they go out to Montana to kill both John and Nancy to prevent this custody thing from happening and the ex getting full custody forever? Well, they had to look into that. As police are looking into that, they're also looking into the fact that there are rumors around town that Nancy, she was really concerned about some local high school kids in the area. She said that she was being spied on by these kids. They were kind of like harassing her as they drove by. They would spy on her as she was sunbathing on her deck. But initially, police didn't really have any evidence to connect any of those kids to what happened to them. They just, at that time, couldn't find anything. Then they interview John's mom. John's mom tells them that John had been in a very, very, very recent potential legal battle with the man who sold him the home, Joe Clark. John found out about certain zoning laws and that this house that was sold was apparently not allowed to operate a commercial business out of it because of these zoning laws. John says that Joe Clark never disclosed that information to him. Joe Clark says I told him everything. I was very upfront with all of it. But this is really irritating to John because he's like, I can't operate this business. This is why we moved here. This is going to be my bread and butter. This is our dream. Now we can't do it. And John was not someone who would back down from things like this, and this is where his hot-headedness got in the way at times. He had approached Joe Clark and threatened to sue him with a civil lawsuit, and he kept kind of yelling at him and accusing him of, like, you did this on purpose, you lied to me, and Joe Clark's like, no, I didn't. Police can see this as being a motive for Joe Clark to commit these murders because of this potential civil lawsuit against him. And then police are looking into everyone and anyone they can in Nancy's life, in John's life, just to see if anyone else was upset with them or anything like that. They learned that John had become very paranoid. He thought that the legal system in Colorado was out to get him. He said that he knew things about the Colorado legal system that he could expose their corruption. And this was all due in part to all of this back and forth with the custody with the kids. He even at one point told someone that he thinks that these people in Colorado will kill him because to prevent him from revealing what he knows. But in the end, all they found out was that these paranoid thoughts were just paranoid thoughts. There was no truth behind the accusations he was saying. John's ex painted him in a very negative light, said he was a jerk. But detectives learned that she was no better. The kids actually didn't like being with her. The kids wanted to be with John, and they really did not want to be with her in Colorado. But she was insistent that she had them. So they continue to dig deep into this custody thing because this could be a very solid motive for someone to kill them. And they investigate. They question as many people. They get documents. They read documents. They pull all the evidence they can. Nothing, not one single thing links that situation to the murders. There's they can confirm that the ex was in Colorado at the time of the murders. She did not. There was no money, going places like high amounts to pay for someone to do this. They couldn't find anything. So they pretty much ruled that angle out. This is when we meet Dannion Brinkley. Dannion Brinkley is a psychic / spiritual medium, and he was brought in by John's mom because John's mom was just desperate for anything. She was desperate for answers, and that police weren't getting anywhere, so maybe, who knows, maybe a psychic could help. And usually in cases like this, psychics typically don't provide genuine information. Sometimes they do, but the majority of the times they don't. So he has a session with John's mom. They have this thing he calls this connection with the heart vibrations or something. I'm not really sure what he said, but he then says he can envision and he can see through the eyes of the killer. He sees everything the killer did. He sees him cutting the phone line. He sees him entering through the window. He sees him turning off the power. He says he entered through a low window, which was a basement window. He can see the killer through his eyes walking up a long staircase. And Dannion's saying, I have this feeling, because I am embodying the killer here, I have this feeling that I've been in this house before, that I know this house really well. And then Dannion says in this vision, he sees a reflection of himself, i.e. the killer, in a mirror, and he sees this young kid, like maybe late teenager, early 20s type kid. He is skinny, he has dark hair, he has these inset eyes. He sees a 9mm in his hand. And then he says he feels that the killer, when he kills both the couple, he sees how he shot John first, and he sees Nancy getting up and trying to put on her glasses, and he sees the killer shooting her. And then he has this feeling of the killer doesn't know exactly why he did this. He doesn't know his own motivation. Then Dannion says he has one final image that the killer was going to be arrested in December. Meanwhile, in December, police get a phone call from police in Newberg, Oregon, that they have information about a college student there who apparently has confessed to committing 2 murders in Big Fork, Montana. This kid is telling disturbing stories to these other kids at school about how he killed this couple. And he shows them a 9mm handgun. He says, "This is the gun that I used to do it." This kid is only known, I guess, around school as, his name is Shadow. So, Montana police, desperate for anything, they go out to Oregon and they see what we can do about this. And they learn Shadow's full name. His name is Joseph Shadow Clark. Does that name sound familiar to you? Clark? That's because Shadow Clark is the son of Joe Clark, the guy who was having a potential legal dispute with John. They also find out that Shadow Clark is one of the kids that Nancy had accused of spying on her. They bring in Shadow for questioning, and initially he denies any of it. He says, "I'm just telling stories. That's all they were, stories." But they question him for a couple more hours, and he finally begins to crack. He starts going from, well, these were dreams and nightmares, to this is what I did. That these nightmares had directed him to do what he did. And then he confesses he was the one to kill John and Nancy Bosco. Here's the crazy thing. He describes the murder, and it is identical, precisely to the every tiny movement of what Daniel Brinkley described in his vision. It was perfect. It was exactly how he said it happened. And what's more is the description he said of the killer in the mirror is exactly looked like. And when he said he had these feelings of, I've been in this house before as the killer, I'm very familiar with this house. Well, Shadow Clark, the home that John and Nancy lived in, that he committed these murders in, it was his childhood home that he grew up in. It was uncanny how accurate Daniel was. Not all of this information was released in the newspapers and to the public. So there's a lot of information that Daniel described that later Shadow would describe that nobody could have possibly known. And so it appears that a psychic in this particular case was not just right, but was freaking dead on. But what was the motive? I mean, was it the legal dispute? Was it that? Did his dad make him do it? No, they found no evidence of that. They ultimately believe that he was so infatuated with Nancy that his goal was to go there and maybe sexually assault her or whatever the case may be, but instead he kind of panicked and just shot John, and when Nancy woke up, he shot her. And then they think that he likely did some sort of sexual act on her after she was dead, but they don't have proof of that. But they believe that it was his obsession with Nancy as to what led him to do this. Truly, though, they don't actually know the full motive, because he claims he has no idea why he did it. He says he just doesn't know. So they never really established for sure with evidence an actual motive. Guess when he was arrested? In December of 1993, exactly like Daniel said would happen. What are the odds? They tell him, listen, we're going for the death penalty on this one, because this was horrific. He then decides to plead guilty instead to avoid the death penalty. And he is initially sentenced to 220 years in prison. But then, I guess, on some kind of appeal, his sentence is reduced to 150 years. Good luck surviving that one. However, he can get paroled when he is 60 years old. So he has got quite some time left before that happens. He is still rotting away in a prison cell, and hopefully this is the type of person that never, ever, ever gets out. One could hope. One could really hope that does not happen. And by the way, they actually found the stolen .357 Magnum in the Clark home that Shadow was living in at the time of the murders. And because this was just before he went to college. But they found that gun in the bedroom that Shadow Clark lived in. It was hidden, but they found it. So that just gave further proof that he was in the house that night. He was the one who committed the murders. It was 100% him. So a psychic got it right. They knew he described everything perfect. I mean, did he actually help solve the crime? No, because ultimately it was police in Oregon who kind of got Shadow to the forefront of this, but it doesn't change the fact that that guy, I mean, he was accurate as hell. I don't normally believe in these types of things when it comes to this, but it's hard to dispute this one. It's difficult. I can't really, I don't know. It's just so weird. And so thankfully it only took a handful of months or so. They weren't waiting years and years and years for the answers on this one. They finally, they got the answers within a 6-month period. And so in the end, Nancy and John Bosco, they got the justice they both rightfully deserved.
Where were they taken last night? Did the police come?
No, they weren't taken. They were shot in my house.
Okay. And did they go to the doctor?
No.
Where are they at right now?
They're in my house. There's blood splattered everywhere.
Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tracy Burke and Karen Comer. Viewer discretion is advised. It was the early morning hours of September 11th, 2007 in a city called Rineyville in Kentucky. A young boy, a 9-year-old, would call 911 to say that his mom and his grandma had both been killed. And this is that 911 call.
911. Somebody broke into our house last night, and I don't know who it was, but they killed everybody here except for my sister, my brother, and me. The only people here are me, my sister, and my brother.
How old is your sister and your brother?
My sister's like a few months old. My brother's only just 4.
How old are you?
9.
Where were they taken last night? Did the police come?
No, they weren't taken. They were shot in my house.
Okay. And did they go to the doctor?
No.
Where are they at right now?
They're in my house. There's blood splattered everywhere.
When police arrive at the home, they enter it and they confirm that there are 2 deceased people inside. There are also 3 children in the house, but they are left physically unharmed. The 9-year-old boy who called 911, his name was Matthew Pete. He said that morning he heard gunshots in the house, and at one point he went out and saw his grandma on the floor, and she was screaming. The grandmother, Karen Comer, was screaming, "I am going to die. I'm dying." The 9-year-old boy panics, and eventually he calls 911. The 2 victims inside the home were 31-year-old Tracy Burke and Tracy Burke's former mother-in-law, 53-year-old Karen Comer. Both had been shot dead. There was broken glass in the house as well. It appeared that whoever did this had broken glass to get inside the home. And 2 of the children inside the house said at one point they heard the breaking glass and they heard the gunshots. Matthew, the 9-year-old, says he got a really brief glimpse of whoever may have done this, and the person was wearing a camouflage jacket. One of the other children, 4-year-old Ian, had actually told his family later down the road that daddy shot and killed mommy. And he said this numerous times to various family members. Well, who was his daddy? Well, his dad was Sergeant Brent Burke. Brent Burke was born and raised in Illinois, and eventually he joined the United States military. He grew up in a military household. His father was in the Army, and that's eventually what he went into. At some point during that, he met a woman named Tracy. At the time they met, Tracy was a nurse, and she had a child from her previous, or technically current, marriage. That her child there was Matthew Pete, the one who eventually calls 911. And supposedly, Brent and Tracy hit it off really well, and eventually Tracy would divorce her then husband and to be with Brent. And from what it sounds like, that divorce between Tracy and her other husband, that ended, from what I understand, amicably for the most part. Tracy and Brent would go on to have 2 more children. So again, when this happens, Matthew is 9, Ian is 4, and there's also a baby just a few months old, basically. Everyone described Tracy as just an incredibly bubbly person with a very infectious personality. She was someone who thoroughly enjoyed helping people, and that's why she became a nurse practitioner. She was an absolute pleasure and a joy to be around. If she was there, you were probably having fun. Most importantly, she doted on her 3 kids. She loved them more than anything on the planet. She wanted to make sure that her kids grew up in a stable household and they got everything that they needed. And quite honestly, it sounds like she would have done anything to protect her kids. When Tracy and Brent first met, some of Tracy's family was not exactly fond of him. They described him during the initial beginning parts of this relationship almost like he was a stalker. But I think it depends on the person you asked that would maybe describe him that way. Tracy's dad would describe Brent as someone who was like super over energetic. He was trying to do too much to please people. Like he was trying just way too hard. There were people who also said that Brent had a temper and he could get to that temper pretty quickly. But then Brent's family would say, while he does have a temper, within 20, 30 minutes, it's kind of like subsided and everything goes back to normal. That he had never been violent before. He never hit anyone before. Certainly, he never abused Tracy or the kids, except for one time where a couple of witnesses would state that at one point, Brent had picked up Matthew, the child that was not his child, and slammed him onto the concrete floor where they were at. Now, Matthew was fine. He had the wind knocked out of him. And why this happened, I'm not 100% sure. But when this did happen, that's when Tracy began to realize, I need to get out of this relationship. I need to get a divorce. And so, by 2007, Tracy is beginning the divorce process. She will move out of the home that she and Brent shared with the 3 kids. She took all 3 kids, including the 2 that belonged to him, and they would actually end up going to Rhineyville, Kentucky, where Tracy's former mother-in-law, Karen Comer, lived. Karen Comer was a type of person, if you needed help, she was there. No questions asked. You asked for it, she's got the answer for you. She's got help for you. People remember her for her very distinct laugh, her love for animals. Karen loved nothing more than sitting in her backyard and watching birds, eat from the bird feeder and flying away. She lived a very calm and serene lifestyle. Karen was also a humongous soap opera fan. She loved The Young and the Restless, and she would watch it every single day. Karen loved to cook. She loved to feed people, and she was a good cook. And Karen was married to a man named Kurt. They had a great relationship, very loving household. And so when Tracy called Karen and say, hey, I have a question to ask you, a favor. Can me and the kids come stay with you? Because, I'm leaving Brent. She didn't even hesitate to answer. She's like, yeah, come on over. I mean, she is so Karen's son is Tracy's former husband, the man she divorced. But again, they had a pretty amicable, divorce situation going on. And so Karen was like, yeah, come on, you can stay with us. No problem. And that's Karen. So when this double homicide occurred, police there in Kentucky first focused on the typical suspect, which would be a husband or a boyfriend or ex-husband, ex-boyfriend. And that's what led them to Sergeant Brent Burke. Now, the son, Matthew, says he saw someone wearing a camouflage jacket in the house. With Brent being in the Army, that's something he would wear. Now, when police looked for that jacket, when they first started to talk to Brent, they couldn't find it. He didn't have one in his home. He didn't have one anywhere else. And at that time, because the divorce was going to be happening, when Tracy moved out, Brent would actually move back to the barracks over at Fort Campbell in Kentucky. So Fort Campbell to Rhineyville, Kentucky, where Tracy was living with Karen, it was it was over 100 miles away. It was like a 2.5-hour drive. Brent didn't have a lot of opportunities to just easily visit his 2 kids. But at any rate, they did not find a camouflage jacket in anywhere where he was at. So they look into him, they find out about this divorce happening, they find out that some people said that he had a bit of a temper. They found out about the story where he had slammed Matthew to the ground, and so they kind of just went with that. And really they honed in on Brent from the beginning, and they never really let up. They didn't necessarily really search for other suspects because Brent just seems like the logical person here. He had the motive because, according to other people, he did not want to get a divorce. He did not like that the marriage was ending. He didn't like that there wasn't going to be like this stable income anymore. But would he kill for that reason because out of anger? Or was he just someone who just didn't want a divorce? He wanted to be with his wife and maybe work it out. And that's up for police to decide. When they interview the kids, Matthew said he thinks he heard someone's voice, a male's voice that night, and it sounded like his stepdad. The 4-year-old Ian would also state that he thought he heard someone's voice that sounded like his dad. And again, when asked, he told people, Daddy shot Mommy. Daddy killed her. There were people who believed that he was coached to say that, but Ian would say it all the time without anyone telling him to say it. That's just what he said. That's what he said really early on in all of this. But again, did he hear that from someone and just sort of went with it because, he's 4 years old, he doesn't really know what to say or believe? It's possible. There was no murder weapon found at the house. However, Tracy's dad told police that about a month or so prior to all of this happening, Tracy's dad had lent a 9mm handgun to Brent. The murder weapon, at least based on the bullets and the ammunition found at the scene, were from a 9mm. Now, also with regards to that, there was a lot of issues with the investigation itself. The police, in their initial investigation, actually didn't find the bullets themselves, even though they were in very plain sight. It wasn't until the cleanup crew came in and they found the bullets. So that was it showed people that the police were just honing in on a suspect and they weren't really thoroughly investigating this. When asked about the gun, Brent said it wasn't a 9mm that his father-in-law gave him. It was actually a .38. However, he wasn't able to produce the gun. The gun was never found. Were there any fingerprints at the scene that matched Brent? No. Was there any additional DNA found at the crime scene? Hair, blood, semen, saliva, anything that linked to Brent? Also no. They had no physical evidence connecting Brent directly to the murders. But again, Brent was their focus because in reality, when they're looking at this, he was really the only one who made sense as to why this happened. By the way, I don't think Karen's husband was at the house when this all happened. I think in the house that night, it was just Tracy, Karen, and the 3 kids. And the husband was cleared or ruled out for anything involved with this. And so police, because nothing was stolen from the house, there was forced entry. But was this a robbery attempt that went wrong? It didn't look that way. There was nobody else in Tracy or Karen's life that would have wanted to do this to them, including Tracy's ex-husband. He was also cleared and ruled out. Brent was just the one who made sense. But can they prove it? That's a whole other story. Brent is arrested and he is charged with the double homicide. And the prosecution and the police, they're basically using circumstantial evidence against him. Again, no physical evidence. There was absolutely nothing that placed Brent in that house. Brent is now going to be facing the death penalty. That's what Kentucky was going with. Before that trial could ever begin, it would end in a mistrial. Just before the trial began, the defense found out that a 14-year-old boy had confessed to the double murders. This was a young man named Deshaun White. He had recanted his confession, though, very quickly after he made it. And they couldn't place him in the house either. It was literally just him saying he did it. But then he recanted. And so because of that, because the defense wasn't told about that entire scenario, the case had to be thrown out before it even began. 4 months goes by. They're set for trial number 2. We're going to try this again. But again, it ends in a mistrial before it really even starts. The key witness, at the time 9-year-old boy Matthew, got very, very sick and he was unable to testify. So they had to declare it a mistrial. He was fine in the end. He wasn't deathly ill or anything, but he just was not able to testify. By August of 2010, a third trial is set to begin. Now, in the interim between that second and third trial, Deshaun White had allegedly confessed again, but then recanted again. Why he was doing that, I don't know. But this third trial actually starts, and they have their key witness, Matthew, go on the stand. The prosecution asks him, did you hear anyone in the house that night? And he actually at this point says yes, he thinks he heard Brent's voice. And he said on the stand that he was confident it was Brent. They asked him, do you see the person in the courtroom today who committed this murder? He said yes. He pointed right to Brent. Now, the defense would kind of pick apart that testimony because initially Matthew, who again was 9 years old at the time, did not tell police or anyone that he distinctly heard Brent's voice in the house, that this is something new. His memory of the event seems to be clearer now than it was back when it happened. The defense also believes that the 4-year-old boy, Ian, was coerced or coached to say that daddy killed mommy. But the family would say, no, he was just saying that all the time. At this trial, the prosecution lays out the timeline because the big key thing here is, could Brent have done this in the time frame that he had? Fort Campbell is 140 miles away from Rhineyville, Kentucky, where Karen lived. This, if you're going the speed limit, is about a 2.5 or so hour drive. That night, Brent got off work at 10:30 p.m. He then goes back to where he was living in the barracks. His roommate both heard and saw Brent come into the barracks at about 11:30 p.m. Brent Burke then leaves the barracks and is not seen again by anyone there at the barracks until 6:30 a.m. the following morning. This is a 7-hour gap of time. The drive, again, 2.5 hours there, 2.5 hours back. That's a 5-hour time frame of just driving, leaving approximately 2 hours for Brent to have broken into the house, killed both Tracy and Karen, and disposed of any potential evidence that may have linked him to the crime, especially the gun. And then, he goes back. That is enough time. The defense was trying to say that wasn't enough time to do all of that. But if Brent drove all the way out there to talk to Tracy and have some kind of conversation about the marriage, it could have very quickly gone south, and he reacted and killed her, and then he had to kill Karen because she was there and probably saw it. You could do all of that in 2 hours. He could have disposed of the gun on the drive back. He could have thrown it out of his window, stopped off at some body of water nearby, and, threw the gun in there. So the defense was saying it wasn't a feasible time frame. The prosecution argued the opposite. When police asked Brent initially, hey, what were you doing in that 7-hour time frame? He goes, well, I did go out in my car and I was driving around and I went truck shopping. Truck shopping at 2:30 in the morning, he said. He said, I was looking for like a 99 model, maybe a 2000 model truck. The cops are like at 2 or 2:30 in the morning. He's like, yeah, I couldn't sleep, so that's what I was doing. Something that Brent did do. I mean, people had confirmed he was looking for a truck, but at 2:30 in the morning, where was he even going to go to shop for a truck? He then tells police that he drives back to Fort Campbell, where he then falls asleep in his car. He said it was just way too hot in the barracks, so I fell asleep in my car. I woke up a little before 6:30 and went back into the barracks. This was a bizarre as hell story. But the cops did not Miranda Brent before he said all of this. And so they could not use any of that information of that bizarre story in the actual trial. The judge threw it out. All because the police forgot to Mirandize him. Just like they forgot to look for or find the bullets that were very clearly there that anyone could see. It was not a great investigation. Also, during the third trial, there was a neighbor to Karen who said that around 10 p.m. that night, he was outside walking his dogs and he heard a couple pop noises. He also heard the yelp of a dog, and that was all he heard. And so it sounded to the defense, oh, okay, so you heard the fatal gunshots then at 10 p.m. Well, we know for a fact that Sergeant Burke is all the way at Fort Campbell at 10 p.m. We can confirm that without a shadow of a doubt. But then other people would come forward to state, well, hearing popping sounds in this area was very common. You would hear gunshots a lot. And that's because not that far away was an Army shooting range that people would be using in the late hours of the evening. And you can actually hear the gunshots from there on a quiet night. And so the prosecution was able to kind of successfully argue that. Like, he didn't necessarily hear the fatal gunshots. but he did hear gunshots. A lot of circumstantial evidence, again, no physical evidence. So this time it actually gets to the jury where they deliberate. They deliberate for 10 hours, and then they come back to the judge and say, we give up. We can't do this. And it's like, what do you mean? We can't agree on the verdict. And so it was a hung jury, therefore, a third mistrial. So 4 years after the initial murder, a fourth trial begins. Needless to say, Tracy's family was really pissed off at the prosecution. They were also really pissed off at the police for bungling the investigation to begin with, and the prosecution for not being able to get this done. They had failed to provide key information to the defense in other trials. It was a mess. This was not a clean investigation. Matthew, the oldest son, is now terrified because at this point, Brent is out and he is sort of just walking the streets freely while he's awaiting a fourth trial. Matthew's like, I'm afraid he's going to come and find me and kill me. He's going to hurt me because, I'm the key witness here. Maybe he's going to hurt or kill my brother. I don't know. He goes, I'm just terrified. But when Brent Burke was released, he was released back into the army and he was required to stay on the barracks. But at the fourth trial, after they presented all the evidence, the jury would deliberate. Once again, hung jury. Again, another mistrial. 4 trials that they have attempted and have failed each time. At this point, again, Brent is, back in the military's custody. And Tracy and Karen's families are both like, this is never going to happen. We're never going to be able to get justice. But the U.S. military said, nah, we're not going to let that happen. So the military begins looking into this case and thinking, well, can we prosecute him? They got all of the evidence and everything from the trials from the Kentucky prosecutor's office. They looked through everything to do with this case, and the military had the same conclusion that the police and the prosecution initially did. Brent's guilty. He did this. And so they placed charges on Brent Burke, and they arrest him. The United States military arrested him. This time they record the actual interrogation and they make sure that he's given all of his rights. He once again tells them, I didn't do it. I wasn't there. I don't know what to tell you. I didn't kill them. The JAG lawyer said, well, even though there are these 4 trials that ended up poorly, first of all, we have the grounds to arrest him because he was active duty when the murders occurred. He was literally on the base, left the base to do this, and then came back to the base. And in military courts, they don't require a unanimous verdict from the jury. And these are technically called court-martials as to what these trials would be, or this trial would be. Sergeant Burke was able to choose between enlisted soldiers to be on the jury or officers to be on the jury, which is not called a jury there, it's called a panel. Sergeant Burke chose 7 senior officers to be his panel. So now he's on trial for the 5th time. They present all of the evidence they have, and they include one more piece of evidence that they claim physically finally places him at the scene. They looked through clothing of Brent's, and as they are, scraping stuff off the clothes, they found a teeny tiny piece of glass. They did one of those refraction tests, with the light hitting it, to see if it was the same glass that was broken at Karen's home to enter the home. And the military people determined that the glass found on his clothing was similar, almost exactly similar to the glass found at Karen's home. The teeny tiny itty bitty piece of glass was the only physical evidence that they had. They still had no murder weapon. They still had no fingerprints. They still had none of his DNA, hair, nothing at the scene. No shoe impressions, no footprints, still nothing. So they were really banking on this tiny piece of glass. His defense would argue this is ridiculous. I mean, glass is glass. How can you even say for sure that this is the exact same glass? Well, you can't. You can just say it's similar. The glass was found on a camouflage piece of clothing, but it wasn't a coat, and it looked different than what Matthew described. That piece of glass could have come from anywhere, is what the defense would say. They also have family testify at the trials, and Brent's father at one point was he was on the stand, and he said, my son didn't do this. And they're like, well, how do you know your son didn't do this? And the father said, because Brent told me he didn't do it. Oh, okay, cool. Oh, that's it. So your own child, your flesh and blood told you when asked him, did you do this? And he just said the word no. That's it. He goes, that's it. That's all I needed. Really? Okay. Case closed. Brent said he didn't do it. He didn't confess to murdering two people to his father. That's it. Case closed. It's done. He's innocent. We all know no one would ever lie about that kind of thing to their parent about murdering someone. Everyone's truthful. Sorry, I'm being a little prick. Now, because this is a court-martial, Brent is also able to inject something else into his trial that he was not able to do at civilian trials. They have this thing called good soldier evidence that basically talks about that person's character as a soldier, how dedicated they are, their records there. And he, by all accounts, was really good at being a soldier. And he had an outstanding record. And so they were able to use that as if it's some kind of evidence to show that he wouldn't murder someone. But all it shows is that he had there was a different Brent. There's two different sides to Brent. There's this good soldier, and then there's this guy who didn't want to get divorced, who didn't want to lose, a certain amount of income, who didn't want to have to go through custody battles, who didn't want to get a divorce. And he was angry. He had a temper. So you can be both things at once. At the end of this now 5th trial, would you believe this or not? I can't believe I'm about to say this. Just kidding. He was actually found guilty this time, guilty on all charges. In the court-martial arena, the sentence is automatically life in prison, no matter what. But the panel would decide whether or not he should get the option for parole. They decided, no, he would not have the option for parole. He is now serving his life in prison without parole sentence. He's done interviews with the local news in Kentucky stating he is innocent. He did not do this. Quite frankly, this is a very, to me, a very perplexing case because he's the, ex-husband with the temper. He had a very bizarre story about his alibi, going to look at trucks at 2:00 in the morning. He fits the bill. He's the angry ex-husband who doesn't want to get a divorce, and maybe he's super angry at Tracy. He goes out there to talk to her, but something happens where he's like, F it, and he shoots her. And then he shoots Karen because he has to. But there wasn't a lot of physical or any physical evidence other than a piece of tiny glass that actually places him at the scene. My gut tells me that he's guilty. He fits the bill. But would I ever be able to go, okay, they've proven he's the one, for sure? I don't think I could say, yeah, they have. My gut tells me he's guilty. My brain tells me I don't know. And that's an issue. But the panel who was, in this case, this is a panel or a jury that was not just random civilians. These were super intelligent, highly trained officers who do this kind of thing literally all the time. They know way more about how this all works than just a basic civilian jury. And so you do have to kind of trust that as well. And so for me, in the end, I truly believe that Tracy Burke and Karen Comer were able to get the justice that they very rightfully deserved. But that is it for this case, True Crime, Maroony, Dooney, Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, hello, I'm Mike. If you're new here, I tell true crime stories here on YouTube, obviously. So please subscribe if you're into that kind of thing. Give the video a like, leave a comment so more people can see it. Hit the bell so you're notified of when I post new videos. I also tell short-form true crime stories over on TikTok. You can find the link to my TikTok in the description of this video below. It's in the link tree. If you also go in that link tree, you'll see my case list, which is over 7,300 names long at this point. Typically, I choose my cases at random. If you have a case you want me to cover, just send me a quick email. My email is listed below. Just the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened. I'll add it to my list. Like I said, I pick them at random, so I can't promise you when I'll cover it. However, if you are a loved one to a missing person or a murdered individual with a cold case, unsolved, or maybe it's solved, but you still want their story told, just let me know in the email that you are a loved one, and I can make sure that case gets the high priority. But that is it for this video, True Crime Maroony. So until the next case, ta-ta and toodles bagoodles for now. Okay. Right.